Hi, prayer partners. Hope you've had a good week. Last several weeks, we've been talking about God's attributes and his characteristics, the fact that he's omniscient, he knows everything, he's omnipresent, he's everywhere, and he's omnipotent. He is all powerful to do anything, and he never changes. He never leaves us or forsakes us. And we've been thinking about that in the context of going through difficulties, hard situations, when the bottom drops out of everything, to recognize and realize he's always there. He knows what's going on. He knows what we're going through, and he's able to do something about it. But I want to kind of turn that around and think about it from the other aspect of when things are going good, when things are at an easy pace in my life. He's still there. He still knows what's going on. He's all powerful to do anything. And he knows who I need to have an encounter with, somebody who needs to have an encounter with him, that he can use me to touch that person, to share with them, to talk to them about God, and to remember that he's always there. Great example of this I find in Luke chapter 10. And it starts out in verse 25, behold, a certain lawyer. That would have been a Jewish priest that was well versed in the Old Testament, knew all the commandments. And again, not just 10, but 613 of those commandments. And he asked Jesus, and he's wanting to humiliate Jesus and shame him publicly. And he says, teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, Jesus said to him, what's written in the law? And what is your reading of it? In other words, what does the Old Testament say, and how do you understand it? What's your take on it? And so in verse 27, he answered and he said, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And then the lawyer here, he adds something to it that's found in the book of Leviticus. It wasn't in the Ten Commandments, but he says, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 28, Jesus said to him, you've answered rightly. Do this, and you will live. But the problem was, it's impossible for a human being to do that. I mean, we all break the law. We all fall short. None of us love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, strength, all the time, every day, every minute of the day. And to be able to love our neighbor like that as well. And he, wanting to justify himself, he said to Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? In verse 30, Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves. They stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, departed, and leaving him half dead. Now, just think about that. This guy's been beat up. He's been humiliated. They stripped him of his clothes. He's been robbed. They were robbers. They've taken all of his money and earthly goods. They've injured him, beat him up, and then they abandon him and just leave him there to die. I think that is a very strong picture of people that we encounter every day of the week, everywhere we go. Folks who've been beat up by this world. Folks who have been humiliated. They don't have this world's goods. Folks who've been injured. Folks who've been abandoned and just left to figure it out as best they can and get by on their own. I've seen it in churches week after week after week. People coming for hope, looking for help, trying to find answers. They've been beat up. They've been humiliated. They've been injured and left for dead. And what do they get when they show up at church? He was beat up. And then it says, not only was he beat up, he was passed up. It says that in verse 31, now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now, what was all that about? Well, he'd not only been beat up, now he's been passed up. The priest on his way from Jericho to Jerusalem to minister in the temple, to go and read scripture, to study, to pray, to offer sacrifices, all of those things that they would have done. And he sees this poor guy laying there, dying, and he says, oh, nope, can't fool with him. I'm on my way to the temple, and if I touch him, or if he touches me, I can't go into the temple when I get to Jerusalem because I'll first have to go through 24 hours of ceremonial cleansing, and I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to have anything to do with him. In other words, I don't want anything to do with broken humanity who's been humiliated, beat up, stripped, and robbed, because I'm too religious for that. You see, in the Old Testament, that same law that said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, also says in Leviticus 19 and 20, I believe it is, that if someone is injured and they've got a sore, a wound on their body that's leaking bodily fluids, they're considered defiled and unclean, and they have to go through the ritual cleansing and ceremonial cleansing before they can go into a holy place of worship, whether it was the temple, the synagogue, or wherever it was. And so this guy's laying there bleeding. He's ceremonially unclean, and if that priest touches him, then he becomes defiled in return. He has to go through the ritual of ceremonial cleansing, so he chooses not to have anything to do with wounded humanity so he can be religious when he gets to Jerusalem. And so he passes by on the other side. Now, the Jews not only believe that in Leviticus, where it says you can't touch these defiled people, they can't touch you or you become defiled, they took that literally and they went to an extreme with it of legalism and said, not only can you not touch them and they not touch you, but if any part of them touches you, you become defiled, including their shadow, because their shadow is a part of them, and God said, don't touch them, don't let them touch you, or you become defiled. And so it says he passed by on the other side of the road, because if that fellow laying there wounded raised his hand up and said, please help me, and tried to get his attention, if when he raised his hand up, it cast a shadow, and that shadow touched the priest, he's defiled. He can't go into the temple when he gets to Jerusalem, so he goes all the way to the other side of the road to go around him. Jesus was stressing to that lawyer that day the absolute arrogance of those who are religious and trying to keep the letter of the law and carrying things to a legalistic extreme and have nothing to do with wounded society who's been beat up and left by the side of the road. And so this priest passes by on the other side. And then just to kind of drive that point home even further, Jesus goes on to say, and likewise a Levite. And you remember the Levites, they were the ones who were in charge of taking care of the temple, making sure everything was clean and presentable, and all the utensils and the offerings were given and all of those kind of things. And it says a Levite, when he arrived at the place where he came and looked and passed by on the other side as well. And again, he's going to the other side of the road, so even that man's shadow doesn't touch him and just leaves him laying there. No regard for him at all. And he goes on. So this guy's been beat up. He's been passed up not once, but twice. And then it goes on to say, and then likewise, a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, he came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. Now, can you imagine how this stung to that lawyer that day when Jesus begins to talk about this Samaritan? Samaritans were hated by Jews and Gentiles because they were half-breeds. They were part Jew, part Gentile, and the Jews hated them because they weren't full-blooded, and the Gentiles hated them because they weren't full-blooded, and nobody wanted anything to do with Samaritans. They were considered outcasts, unclean, defiled. And so, but when he sees this guy who's been beat up, it says that in verse 34, he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii and gave to the innkeeper and said to him, take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I come again, I'll repay you. And then Jesus asked this question. So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? The religious guys, the guys from church, or the fellow who was willing to stop and get involved in his life? The fellow who recognized there's a man who's been beat up. There's a man who's been passed up. and there's a man who needs picked up. And it says that he took care of him. And then Jesus asked that question. So who was neighbor to him? Who was not only in close proximity to him, but who was willing to get involved in his life? Who was willing to go beyond the status quo of what the traditional religious establishment said should happen and be able to touch this guy's life? My friend, we have a God who is omniscient. He knows everything. He is omnipresent. He is everywhere, and he is all powerful. He knows everything. He knows what's going on with your next door neighbor. He knows what they're involved in. He knows what they need. And he knows where you've been and what you've been through and how you could reach into his life and share with him your experiences. I want to ask you a question, and we may visit this a little bit more next week too. This guy's been beat up, he's been passed up twice, and he's been picked up. Beat up, physical wounds, injured, but then passed up. Which one do you think hurt most and inflicted the most damage? To be beat up or to be passed up? To be humiliated or to be excluded? I have a little saying that it sounds like I'm trying to be funny, but I really believe it's true. The reason most folks don't go to church is because most folks know somebody who goes to church. They see the hypocrisy. They see the shallow, empty religion we have. They see us when we fail to realize that God's omniscient, he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent. They see the emptiness of cold religion that excludes God or has failed to recognize that God is all powerful, that God is everywhere, that God knows everything. And because we forget that as a church, we don't think we have what it takes to go next door and knock on our neighbor's door and tell them about Jesus. They think when we see our neighbor doing something out in the yard and they need some help, that it's not important enough to go over there and help them. But the truth is, God knows everything. He knows everything about your next door neighbor, about those people you run into at Walmart, and he's able to do something about it. And it's one of those divine appointments that he just puts us in place right where we need to be, when we need to be there, with the experience we have, and to rely and depend completely and totally on God, because he's all powerful, he never changes, and he's right there. So I want to ask you that question: who's your neighbor? And what are you doing to reach them? Have they been beat up? Are they being passed up by you and me? Or are we willing to get involved and pick them up for Jesus? God bless. Have a great week.